Imagine a world where two of the most fearsome dictators in history, sworn enemies representing diametrically opposed ideologies, suddenly join hands. What if the man who wrote of destroying Judeo-Bolshevism and the leader of the world's first communist state secretly agreed to carve up nations between them? This isn't the plot of a dystopian novel. It's exactly what happened in August 1939. This is the story of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, an alliance so cynical, so treacherous, it would plunge the world into its deadliest conflict and set the stage for unimaginable betrayal. How could two such bitter foes become partners in crime? The answer lies in a pact that would forever be remembered as the unholiest of alliances. It began with a deal, a breathtaking act of political cynicism that defied all logic and expectation. In the late summer of 1939, as the world held its breath on the brink of war, two mortal enemies, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, performed a stunning diplomatic pirouette. On August 23rd, their foreign ministers, Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov, signed a pact in Moscow that would shake the foundations of international politics. To the public, it was presented as a simple treaty of non-aggression, a mutual promise to refrain from attacking one another. It was a lie. The document they signed was a facade, a carefully constructed illusion to mask a far more sinister reality. Hidden from the world's view, attached to the public treaty, was a secret protocol. This clandestine addendum was the true heart of the agreement, and its contents were nothing short of diabolical. It was a cold-blooded blueprint for the dismemberment of Eastern Europe. In these secret clauses, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, the titans of totalitarianism, had agreed to divide the sovereign nations lying between their two empires into spheres of influence. Poland, a nation that had only regained its independence 2 decades prior, was to be partitioned. The northern half of its territory would fall to Germany, while the eastern half would be absorbed by the Soviet Union. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, along with Finland and a part of Romania, were designated to fall under the Soviet sphere. It was the most cynical deal in modern history, a gangster's pact drawn up on a continental scale. For the next 22 months, this unholy alliance held firm, transforming the geopolitical landscape of Europe. Stalin, the communist dictator, effectively became Hitler's silent partner in conquest. As the Nazi war machine unleashed its blitzkrieg, first on Poland in September 1939, and then storming across Western Europe, the Soviet Union played the role of a crucial enabler. While German panzers rolled towards Paris, Soviet trains rolled towards Germany, laden with the lifeblood of modern warfare. Stalin's regime supplied the Third Reich with vast quantities of oil, essential for fueling its tanks and aircraft. Soviet grain fed the German army and populace, preventing the food shortages that had crippled Germany in the First World War. Critical raw materials, from rubber to manganese and phosphates, flowed westward, greasing the wheels of the Nazi military-industrial complex. This cooperation went beyond mere economic exchange. When Germany invaded Poland from the west on September 1st, the world watched in horror. Just over 2 weeks later, on September 17th, Stalin fulfilled his end of the bargain. The Red Army invaded Poland from the east, snuffing out the last vestiges of Polish resistance. The two invading armies met, shook hands, and held joint victory parades. The Soviet Union then moved to consolidate its gains as outlined in the secret protocol. It annexed the Baltic states, waged a brutal winter war against Finland to seize territory, and forced Romania to cede Bessarabia. From the outside, it appeared that Stalin had masterfully maneuvered his nation out of the immediate path of the Nazi juggernaut. He had expanded his empire and bought what he believed was precious time. From his vantage point in the Kremlin, Stalin was convinced he had played a masterful game of geopolitical chess. He looked upon Hitler not as a trusted ally, but as a temporary, manageable tool. He viewed the democracies of Britain and France with deep suspicion, believing they sought to incite a war between Germany and the Soviet Union, hoping the two totalitarian giants would bleed each other dry. By signing the pact, Stalin thought he had brilliantly turned the tables, directing Hitler's aggression westward while he, Stalin, reaped territorial rewards and gained a buffer zone. He saw himself as the ultimate realist, a pragmatist who had outwitted the fanatical German Führer. He believed the pact had bought him years, perhaps until 1942 or 1943, to complete the modernization of the Red Army and prepare for the inevitable clash. He dismissed the mounting intelligence reports from his own spies, from British sources, and even from defectors, all warning of an imminent German invasion. He saw them as provocations, attempts by Western intelligence to trick him into a premature conflict with Germany. He was catastrophically, monumentally wrong. The man he thought he could control was merely biding his time, and the partnership he had built was a house of cards, about to be blown away by the most massive invasion in human history. When we think of World War II, we often picture the Blitz over London or the D-Day landings in Normandy. But the single largest and most brutal conflict of the entire war took place on the Eastern Front, and it was a war unlike any other. It began with a lie, a spectacular act of betrayal. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, stunning the world. To many, it seemed like an unholy alliance between two sworn enemies. But for Adolf Hitler, this pact was never meant to last. It was just a temporary convenience, a strategic pause to avoid a two-front war while he dealt with Poland and then Western Europe. His true, ultimate goal was always in the East. This goal had a name, Lebensraum, or living space. It was an idea Hitler had laid out years earlier in his manifesto, Mein Kampf. He believed that the German people, the Aryan race, were destined to expand eastward, to seize the vast, fertile lands of the Soviet Union. This land would provide resources, food, and space for German colonization. But this wasn't going to be a conventional war of conquest, like the swift campaign against France. This was to be a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. The distinction is absolutely critical. A war of conquest is about defeating an enemy army and occupying its territory. A war of annihilation is about destroying an entire people, an entire ideology, an entire way of life. The ideology Hitler sought to obliterate was what he called Judeo-Bolshevism. In his twisted worldview, communism was a Jewish conspiracy designed to undermine the world, and the Soviet Union was its dark heart. Therefore, the war in the East was framed as a crusade, a holy war against this existential threat. It wasn't just about defeating the Red Army. It was about eradicating every trace of communism and its supposed Jewish masterminds. This ideological fanaticism was the fuel for the unimaginable brutality that was about to be unleashed. The people living in these lands, the Slavic peoples of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, were deemed Untermenschen, or subhumans, in Nazi ideology. They weren't seen as a population to be governed, but as a resource to be exploited, and ultimately, a problem to be eliminated. This racial and ideological hatred was codified into official orders given to the German army before the invasion even began. The infamous Commissar Order, for example, instructed German soldiers to immediately execute any captured Soviet political commissars, a clear violation of the laws of war. Other directives encouraged extreme measures against civilians, effectively giving soldiers a license to kill. The war against the Soviet Union was explicitly designed to be a war without rules, without mercy, without honor. The goal wasn't just military victory, but the biological and cultural destruction of the Slavic peoples to make way for German settlers. Behind the regular army, the Wehrmacht, came the Einsatzgruppen. These were mobile killing squads, death squads whose specific task was to round up and murder Jews, communist officials, and anyone else deemed an enemy of the Reich. They would follow the army's advance, systematically massacring hundreds of thousands of civilians in mass shootings. This was the Holocaust by bullets, the first phase of the final solution, carried out in broad daylight in countless ravines and forests across Eastern Europe. The scale of the killing was unprecedented. It was a calculated, industrialized process of murder, driven by a cold, bureaucratic fanaticism. The fate of the Soviet prisoners of war is another dark chapter in this story. In the West, Allied prisoners held by the Germans were generally treated according to the Geneva Conventions. In the East, it was a different reality. Soviet soldiers who surrendered were seen not as prisoners, but as subhuman representatives of a criminal regime. They were deliberately starved, left exposed to the elements, and worked to death. Of the nearly 6 million Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans, over 3 million died in captivity. This was not a tragic accident of war. It was a deliberate policy of extermination through neglect. This war of annihilation created a cycle of violence that consumed the entire region. The German army's brutality against civilians fueled a fierce partisan resistance movement. In response, the Germans carried out brutal anti-partisan operations, often wiping out entire villages in reprisal for any attack. It was a total war, where the line between soldier and civilian was completely erased, and every man, woman, and child was caught in the crossfire. The Eastern Front became the deadliest theater in human history, a landscape of scorched earth and mass graves where tens of millions perished. Understanding the concept of Vernichtungskrieg is essential to understanding not just World War II, but the depths to which humanity can sink when driven by ideologies of hate. Imagine you're the most powerful person in the world. You've built an empire on suspicion, purging rivals and trusting no one. Your spies are everywhere. You see conspiracies in every shadow. Yet, you make one colossal, earth-shattering mistake. You trust the one man you should fear the most. This is the story of Joseph Stalin and the great delusion that almost cost him everything. The year is 1941. The world is on fire. Hitler's Germany has conquered much of Europe, but a fragile peace exists between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union, thanks to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Stalin, the man of steel, believes this pact is his masterstroke, a guarantee of security that buys him precious time to build his Red Army. He is utterly convinced of his own strategic genius. He is catastrophically wrong. In the spring of 1941, the warnings started to pour in. It wasn't a trickle, it was a flood. Over 80 distinct warnings of an impending German invasion reached Stalin's desk. These weren't vague rumors from questionable sources. These were concrete, detailed intelligence reports from the highest levels. Winston Churchill, a man Stalin loathed but who shared a common enemy in Hitler, sent personal messages. He warned Stalin explicitly that the Germans were massing their forces on the Soviet border. Stalin read the dispatch and scribbled a note to his secret police chief. "This is a provocation from British intelligence. Find out who is organizing it and punish them." To him, it was just another classic British trick, an attempt to drag the Soviet Union into their war with Germany. He saw it not as a warning, but as a manipulation. Then came the intelligence from his own people. Richard Sorge, his master spy in Tokyo, was perhaps the greatest intelligence agent of the 20th century. Sorge had access to the German ambassador in Japan and provided the exact date of the planned invasion, June 22nd. He sent multiple urgent cables. Stalin's reaction? He dismissed Sorge's intelligence, scrawling on one report, "This is a man who's set up factories and brothels in Japan and is sending us garbage." The information was too perfect, too direct. In Stalin's paranoid world, anything so straightforward had to be a trap. The evidence on the ground was even more undeniable. German reconnaissance planes flew openly over Soviet territory mapping out targets. The Red Army's own border guards reported a massive buildup of German divisions, tanks, and artillery right across the frontier. We're talking about 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft moving into position. You couldn't hide an operation of that scale. German soldiers, disillusioned with Hitler's plan, began defecting, crossing the border to warn the Soviets. One deserter, a communist named Alfred Liskow, swam a river under fire to bring a warning just hours before the attack began. He told his Soviet interrogators the exact time of the invasion, 4 a.m. When this report reached the high command, it was treated with suspicion. Stalin himself, when informed, reportedly cursed, suspecting it was a German plant designed to provoke him into mobilizing, thereby giving Hitler an excuse to attack. The logic was twisted, but in Stalin's mind it made perfect sense. He was playing a grand chess match with Hitler, and he believed he understood his opponent. He thought Hitler was rational, that he wouldn't be foolish enough to open a second front while still fighting Britain. He had a treaty, after all. He believed Hitler would issue an ultimatum, or make demands before launching an all-out war. The idea of a surprise attack, a complete betrayal without warning, simply didn't fit into his worldview. He was so certain of this that he projected his own cunning logic onto his enemy, failing to grasp the sheer audacity and ideological fanaticism driving the Third Reich. This created a bizarre and deadly paradox. Stalin, the master of paranoia who had executed millions on the faintest whisper of disloyalty, who saw enemies behind every corner within his own country, chose to place his absolute faith in the word of Adolf Hitler, the world's most notorious liar and his ideological arch-nemesis. He had constructed an entire system designed to filter out dissent and deliver only the information he wanted to hear. His subordinates were terrified to challenge him. Any intelligence that contradicted his core belief that Germany would not attack in 1941 was dismissed as enemy propaganda or outright disinformation. In the final, tense hours before the dawn of June 22nd, the atmosphere in the Kremlin was thick with a surreal denial. General Georgy Zhukov, one of the few men who could speak somewhat frankly to Stalin, pleaded with him. He and the Chief of Staff, General Timoshenko, presented the overwhelming evidence: the deserters' testimony, the sound of German engines across the border, the cutting of communication lines by German commandos. They begged Stalin for permission to put the frontier troops on full combat alert. Stalin hesitated. He paced his office, puffing on his pipe. To put the army on high alert was a provocative act. It could be the very spark that ignited the conflict he was so desperate to avoid. He was trapped in his own web of logic. He feared that if he reacted, he would be blamed for starting the war. Finally, he gave a partial, fatally weak order. A directive was sent out, but it was confusing. It warned of a possible attack, but ordered troops not to respond to provocations, and to avoid any actions that could be misinterpreted by the Germans. It was an order to be ready for war, but not to fight back. By the time this watered-down message reached many of the frontline units, it was already too late. In some cases, commanders received it after the German artillery had already begun to fall. At 4 a.m. on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa was unleashed. The largest invasion in human history began. 3 massive German army groups smashed across the border. The Luftwaffe obliterated Soviet airfields, destroying thousands of planes on the ground before they could even take off. The Red Army, caught completely by surprise, its leadership paralyzed by Stalin's orders, began to disintegrate. The initial hours were chaos. Stalin refused to believe the news. When his generals reported that German bombs were falling on Soviet cities, his first reaction was that it had to be a mistake, a provocation by rogue German generals that Hitler would surely stop. It was only after hours of overwhelming reports of a full-scale invasion along the entire front that the reality began to sink in. The great delusion had shattered. The man of steel, the infallible leader, had been played for a fool. His refusal to see the truth had led his country to the brink of utter destruction. The cost of this single, monumental failure of judgment would be measured in the tens of millions of lives. The next 4 years would become a brutal, desperate struggle for survival, a conflict that would redefine the Eastern Front as the most horrific theater of war in history. It stands as a terrifying lesson in how even the most powerful and paranoid leader can be blinded by their own certainties, leading their nation into an abyss. Picture this. It's 3:15 a.m. on a quiet Sunday morning, June 22, 1941. Along an enormous 1,800-mile stretch of land, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, an eerie stillness hangs in the air. Soldiers on both sides of the border between the German Reich and the Soviet Union are largely unaware of the cataclysm about to unfold. Then, in an instant, the silence is annihilated. The sky erupts in a hellish symphony of artillery fire, the ground trembles from the roar of thousands of tank engines, and the air is torn apart by the scream of dive bombers. This was the moment Operation Barbarossa was unleashed. This was, and still is, the single largest land invasion in the entire history of humankind. The scale of this operation is almost impossible to comprehend. Over 3 million German soldiers, alongside hundreds of thousands from allied nations like Romania and Finland, stormed across the border. They were supported by a terrifying force of 3,600 tanks, more than 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,700 aircraft that darkened the skies. Hitler had thrown nearly everything he had at the Soviet Union, gambling his entire empire on one decisive blitzkrieg-style campaign. His goal? To crush the Red Army and dismantle the Soviet state in a matter of months, before the brutal Russian winter could set in. The German war machine was organized into 3 colossal army groups, each with a specific strategic objective. In the north, Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal von Lieb, drove towards the historic city of Leningrad. Their mission was to seize the city, severing the Soviet Union's vital Baltic Sea access and capturing a powerful symbol of the revolution. In the center, the most powerful of the 3, Army Group Center under Field Marshal von Bock, had the ultimate prize in its sights: Moscow. This was the political, economic, and spiritual heart of the Soviet Union. Capturing Moscow, the Germans believed, would decapitate the Soviet command structure and lead to a swift collapse of the entire nation. This central thrust was the spearhead, the main effort designed to deliver the knockout blow. And in the south, Army Group South, led by Field Marshal von Rundstedt, had a different but equally crucial target. They advanced through the vast, fertile lands of Ukraine, aiming for Kiev and then pushing onward toward the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. Oil was the lifeblood of modern warfare. Securing these fields would fuel Germany's war machine for years to come, while simultaneously starving the Soviets of their own precious energy resources. The initial impact of this 3-pronged assault was devastating. The Soviet forces, caught completely by surprise, were in a state of disarray. Just 2 years prior, in 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union had shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty. Stalin, the iron-fisted dictator of the Soviet Union, had stubbornly refused to believe the mountains of intelligence reports from his own spies and even from British sources warning of an imminent German attack. He dismissed them as provocations, attempts by the West to drive a wedge between him and Hitler. He had placed his trust in the pact, and now that trust was being paid for in blood. The Soviet frontier troops were overwhelmed. Communications were cut, command structures disintegrated, and entire armies found themselves encircled and annihilated before they even knew what was happening. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, targeted Soviet airfields in the opening hours, destroying thousands of aircraft while they were still on the ground. This gave Germany complete air superiority, allowing their Stuka dive bombers to act as flying artillery, terrorizing Soviet troops and clearing the way for the panzer divisions on the ground. The German blitzkrieg, or lightning war, tactics that had conquered Poland and France with such shocking speed were once again proving lethally effective. Panzers would punch through the front lines, racing deep into enemy territory while motorized infantry followed close behind to consolidate the gains. They created vast pockets, trapping hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers. The encirclements at Minsk and Smolensk in the early weeks were catastrophic for the Soviets, resulting in over 1 million casualties and prisoners. It seemed as if nothing could stop the German juggernaut. And what of Stalin? The man who held absolute power over 200 million people? When the news of the invasion finally reached him, he didn't deliver a defiant speech or rally his people. Instead, he had a complete and total breakdown. He retreated to his dacha outside Moscow, utterly paralyzed by shock and disbelief. For 10 agonizing days, the Soviet Union was effectively leaderless. Stalin vanished from public view, refusing to speak on the radio, convinced his generals had failed him and that his country was lost. It was a period of terrifying silence from the Kremlin as the Wehrmacht advanced deeper and deeper into Soviet territory. Finally, on July 3rd, Stalin emerged from his self-imposed isolation. He addressed the nation over the radio, not as the confident, all-powerful leader, but with a faltering voice. He called the people, "Brothers, sisters, my friends," a stark departure from his usual formal tone. He acknowledged the grave danger and called for a scorched earth policy. Everything that could not be evacuated, factories, crops, livestock, was to be destroyed to deny it to the advancing enemy. He called for total mobilization and a patriotic war against the invaders. This speech, however desperate, marked a turning point. It signaled that despite the catastrophic losses, the Soviet Union would not surrender. The fight for survival had just begun. As the summer of 1941 wore on, the German advance continued, but it began to slow. The vast distances of the Soviet Union were a weapon in themselves. Supply lines became stretched to their breaking point. The panzers, which had performed so brilliantly, were being worn down by the constant fighting and the poor Russian roads, which turned to thick mud after a rain. Soviet resistance, though often disorganized, was becoming fiercer and more desperate. Soldiers and partisans fought with incredible bravery, often to the last man, slowing the German timetable. Hitler himself made a fateful decision in August. Instead of allowing Army Group Center to make a final, decisive push for Moscow, he diverted many of its panzer divisions south. He wanted to secure the agricultural and industrial resources of Ukraine and encircle a massive Soviet force near Kiev before moving on the capital. While the Battle of Kiev was a stunning tactical victory for the Germans, resulting in the capture of over 600,000 Soviet soldiers, it caused a critical delay. By the time the Germans refocused on Moscow in October, under the codename Operation Typhoon, the weather was turning against them. The autumn rains, known as the Rasputitsa, turned the landscape into a sea of impassable mud, bogging down vehicles and halting the advance. And then came the real enemy, General Winter. Temperatures plummeted to levels the German soldiers were completely unprepared for. Their equipment failed. Engines wouldn't start, lubricants froze solid, and weapons jammed. The soldiers themselves, still in their summer uniforms, suffered horrific frostbite. The Soviets, on the other hand, were accustomed to these conditions. They had winter uniforms, winter-grade oils, and the will to defend their capital at all costs. Fresh, well-equipped divisions from Siberia, veterans of battles with the Japanese, were transferred to the Moscow front. They launched a massive counteroffensive in early December 1941, catching the exhausted and frozen Germans completely by surprise. The seemingly invincible Wehrmacht was stopped, then pushed back from the gates of Moscow. The failure to capture Moscow before winter marked the failure of the entire Barbarossa strategy. The war was not going to be a short, victorious campaign. It was now a brutal, grinding war of attrition, a war that Germany, with its limited resources and manpower, was ill-equipped to win against the vastness of the Soviet Union and its seemingly endless reserves of people. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, had turned into the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. The gamble had failed, and it would ultimately be paid for on the blood-soaked plains of Eastern Europe. Thank you for watching. If you found this dive into history interesting, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the pivotal moments that shaped our world. See you next time. Ever wonder what it looks like when one of the largest armies in history just melts away? In the summer of 1941, the world witnessed exactly that. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, kicked off with a level of success that was almost unbelievable. On June 22nd, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, struck first and struck hard. In a matter of hours, they wiped over 2,000 Soviet aircraft off the map. The shocking part? Most of these planes were destroyed before they even had a chance to take off, sitting like ducks on their airfields. On the ground, the situation was just as catastrophic for the Soviets. The Red Army was in a state of disarray. Years earlier, Stalin had conducted a brutal purge of his own military, executing or imprisoning many of his most experienced and competent officers. What was left was a leadership structure crippled by fear and lacking initiative. So, when the German panzers rolled across the border, the Red Army was caught completely, utterly by surprise. The Germans unleashed their signature tactic, the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was a terrifyingly effective combination of speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. The panzer divisions didn't just push the front line back, they sliced deep into Soviet territory, racing ahead of the main infantry forces. Their goal was to encircle massive pockets of Soviet troops, cutting them off from their supply lines and from any possibility of retreat. This strategy created what the Germans called Kesselschlacht, or cauldron battles. And the scale of these encirclements was staggering. Near the city of Minsk, German armor snapped shut a trap around 300,000 Soviet soldiers. Think about that number. It's the size of a major city's population, suddenly surrounded and facing annihilation. It seemed like a textbook victory, a brutal demonstration of German military prowess. But the Germans were just getting started. As they advanced deeper into Ukraine, they executed an even bigger encirclement. Near Kiev, the capital, they managed to trap over 600,000 Red Army soldiers. This was one of the largest encirclements in the history of warfare. For the German High Command, it all looked so familiar. It was a repeat of their stunning victory over France just a year earlier, but on an even grander scale. The Soviet state seemed to be teetering on the brink of total collapse. Back in Berlin, confidence was sky high. The generals and even Hitler himself were convinced that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would cave in with one good kick. They believed the resistance would crumble, and the war would be over in a matter of months. Their soldiers were told to expect to be home by Christmas, celebrating a swift and total victory. The Red Army appeared to be disintegrating, its soldiers either captured, killed, or fleeing in disarray. From the outside, it looked like the end. But the vast distances of Russia and the brutal will of its people were factors the Germans had dangerously underestimated. The war was far from over. Did you know one decision may have cost Germany the entire Second World War? Let's travel back to the summer of 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, is in full swing. The Wehrmacht, with its devastating Blitzkrieg tactics, is tearing through Soviet defenses. The road to Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, seems wide open. The German High Command, the OKH, led by seasoned generals like Franz Halder and Fedor von Bock, was unanimous. They believed that capturing Moscow before winter was the key to victory. Moscow wasn't just the capital. It was the political, industrial, and transportation hub of the entire nation. Its fall would be a catastrophic blow to Soviet morale and their ability to continue the war. Army Group Center, the most powerful of the three German army groups, was poised for the final push. They were just over 200 miles away. Victory seemed within their grasp. But one man disagreed: Adolf Hitler. He was mesmerized by the economic prizes of the Soviet Union. Specifically, he was obsessed with Ukraine. He saw it as the breadbasket of Europe, rich in grain, coal, and vital industrial resources. He believed that seizing these resources would cripple the Soviet war machine and fuel Germany's. To him, economic objectives were more important than capturing a symbolic capital. So, in late August 1941, against the strenuous objections of nearly all his top commanders, Hitler made a fateful decision. He issued Directive 34, ordering the powerful panzer divisions of Army Group Center, under the brilliant command of Heinz Guderian, to halt their advance on Moscow. Instead, they were to turn south. Their new mission? To swing down behind the Soviet Southwestern Front defending Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and help Army Group South encircle them. Guderian was furious. He even flew to Hitler's headquarters to protest in person, arguing that they were wasting their best opportunity to knock the Soviets out of the war. He pleaded that Moscow was the primary objective, and this diversion would be a disastrous delay. But Hitler was unyielding. He dismissed the general's concerns, calling them obsessed with outdated Napoleonic strategies of capturing capitals. For Hitler, the war was about resources, or Lebensraum, living space, and Ukraine was the prize. From a purely tactical standpoint, the move was a spectacular success. The panzers from Army Group Center linked up with Army Group South, trapping a colossal Soviet force around Kiev. The battle that followed was one of the largest encirclements in military history. When the dust settled, the Germans had captured over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. It was a victory of staggering proportions, a tactical masterpiece that seemed to justify Hitler's decision completely. The German propaganda machine went into overdrive, hailing the genius of the Führer. But this stunning victory masked a catastrophic strategic failure. The Kyiv operation took time, precious time. The drive on Moscow, codenamed Operation Typhoon, was paused for 2 critical months. While the panzers were busy in the south, the Soviets were not idle. Under the ruthless leadership of Stalin, they frantically built up their defenses around Moscow. Fresh divisions, including well-equipped Siberian troops accustomed to harsh weather, were brought in from the Far East. Anti-tank ditches were dug, fortifications were built, and the entire city was turned into a fortress. When Operation Typhoon finally resumed in late September, the window of opportunity had started to close. The German forces pushed forward, but they were no longer facing a disorganized and reeling enemy. They were facing a determined, well-prepared foe. And then something even more formidable arrived: the Russian weather. In early October, the autumn rains began. This wasn't just a bit of rain, this was the infamous Rasputitsa, the season of mud. The unpaved Russian roads, which were little more than dirt tracks, dissolved into impassable quagmires of deep, sticky mud. The Blitzkrieg, a strategy reliant on speed and mobility, ground to a halt. Tanks, trucks, and artillery became hopelessly bogged down. Supply lines, already stretched to their breaking point, collapsed. Soldiers were exhausted, fighting not just the enemy, but the very earth beneath their feet. By the time the ground finally froze solid in November, allowing the advance to lurch forward again, it was too late. The German soldiers, still in their summer uniforms, were unprepared for the brutal Russian winter that followed. Temperatures plunged to -30, even -40 degrees Celsius. Engines wouldn't start. Weapons froze solid. Frostbite caused more casualties than combat. The once unstoppable German war machine was literally frozen in its tracks, just a few dozen miles from the spires of the Kremlin. The counterattack came in early December. The fresh, winter-equipped Siberian divisions, under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, slammed into the exhausted and frozen Germans. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was not just stopped, it was thrown back in a major retreat. The myth of German invincibility was shattered in the snows outside Moscow. So, was Hitler's decision the fatal mistake? Many historians and military analysts believe so. By diverting his forces to Kiev, he sacrificed his best, and perhaps only, chance to capture Moscow and potentially win the war in 1941. The massive tactical victory at Kiev was a hollow one, bought at the price of ultimate strategic failure. It gave the Soviets the two things they needed most: time to regroup and the arrival of their most powerful ally, General Winter. The war would drag on for 4 more brutal years, but the turning point, the moment the tide began to shift, can be traced back to that single, fateful decision in the summer of 1941. a choice that prioritized short-term economic gain over the decisive strategic objective. What do you think? Was the focus on Ukraine a brilliant economic move, or the single greatest blunder of the war? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever heard the saying, "Don't invade Russia in the winter"? It's a piece of advice that has echoed through history, a lesson learned the hard way by some of the most powerful armies ever assembled. In 1941, it was Adolf Hitler's turn to learn this brutal lesson. His Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union, was meant to be a swift, decisive campaign. The German war machine, the Wehrmacht, seemed unstoppable. It sliced through Soviet defenses, capturing millions of soldiers and vast territories. By the autumn of 1941, the German army stood at the very gates of Moscow. The Soviet capital was in a panic. The government was preparing to evacuate, and the fall of the city seemed inevitable. The Germans were confident. They believed the Soviet Union was on the brink of total collapse, just one final push away from victory. But then, something happened that they hadn't planned for. Then came the cold. It wasn't just any cold. It was the earliest and most brutal winter Russia had seen in decades. The temperature plummeted to depths the German soldiers, still clad in their thin summer uniforms, could barely comprehend. -20, -30, even -40 degrees Celsius. This was a cold that didn't just bite, it killed. The German war machine, so terrifyingly efficient in the summer, began to grind to a halt. Lubricants in guns and artillery pieces froze solid, rendering them useless. The powerful engines of their panzer tanks refused to start, their metal shells becoming icy tombs for their crews. Fuel turned to jelly in the lines. For the soldiers themselves, it was a living nightmare. They huddled together for warmth, their breath turning to ice in the air. Frostbite became as deadly an enemy as the Red Army. Fingers, toes, noses, and ears turned black and fell off. Tens of thousands of German soldiers became casualties not from bullets or shells, but from the relentless, unforgiving cold. They were unprepared, ill-equipped, and utterly demoralized by an enemy they couldn't fight, an enemy they called General Winter. Despite the horrific conditions, the German command, driven by a desperate obsession with capturing Moscow, pushed their exhausted troops forward. In early December, a few reconnaissance units pushed so far ahead that they could actually see the iconic spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. They were just a few miles from the heart of the Soviet Union. They had reached the gates of Moscow. But this was not a moment of triumph. It was the last gasp of a dying offensive. The soldiers who saw those spires were frozen, starving, and at the absolute end of their strength. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had conquered Europe, had finally met its match in the vast, frozen plains of Russia. It was here, at this critical moment, with the Germans stalled and freezing in the forests outside the capital, that the Soviets struck back. While the Germans were freezing, the Soviets were preparing. Joseph Stalin had made a high-stakes gamble. Relying on intelligence that Japan would not attack from the east, he ordered the transfer of dozens of fresh elite divisions from the depths of Siberia. These were not the battered troops the Germans had faced all summer. These Siberian soldiers were hardened warriors, fully equipped for winter warfare. They wore warm, quilted uniforms, felt boots, and white camouflage. Their equipment was designed to function in the extreme cold, and they knew how to fight and survive in it. On December 5, 1941, these fresh Siberian divisions, alongside other revitalized Red Army units, launched a massive and desperate counterattack. They slammed into the exhausted and frozen German lines. The shock was immense. The Germans, who had believed the Red Army to be completely defeated, were suddenly facing a powerful, well-equipped, and determined enemy emerging from the blizzards. The German advance on Moscow wasn't just stopped, it was thrown back. For the first time in the Second World War, the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht was forced into a large-scale retreat. They abandoned their frozen equipment, their dead comrades, and their dream of a quick victory. The Battle of Moscow was a turning point. The Blitzkrieg had failed. The war in the East, which Hitler had boasted would last a mere 6 weeks, would now drag on for 4 more long, bloody years. The gates of Moscow became the high water mark of the German invasion. From this point forward, it would be a brutal war of attrition that would consume millions of lives and vast resources. The frozen forests outside the Soviet capital did more than just stop an army. They became the place where the myth of German invincibility died. Ultimately, this failure at the gates of Moscow set the stage for the eventual destruction of the Third Reich on the Eastern Front, a conflict that would rightly be called the graveyard of Hitler's empire. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history fascinating, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the most pivotal moments of the past. Let me know in the comments what other historical events you'd like to see covered. See you in the next video.